call to focus on unity at this year's G20 Summit in Bali. The meeting ended in a declaration deploring Russia's attack on Ukraine. But are all nations truly on the same page? And how much did geopolitics blur the usual economic agenda? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the G20 Summit. The European Union plus 19 countries in the G20 have concluded their annual meeting in Indonesia. On the agenda was a dizzying array of issues from hunger to nuclear threats, with a Western-led push to condemn Russia's attack on Ukraine dominating the summit. That push was given further impetus after a missile landed in eastern Poland, prompting emergency meetings. Earlier, the family photo, something usually stock standard at these events, was dropped, as posing alongside Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov became a liability for some. And while these summits usually end with a release of a joint communiqué, a document that by definition all parties agree to, this year's G20 released a joint declaration instead, which some members were reluctant to sign. Right off the bat, though, host nation Indonesia pleaded for unity and focus on global problems, including inflation, hunger, and high energy prices, all exacerbated by the conflict in Ukraine.
Ukraine is one of the world's largest producers of wheat, but its ability to get those grains to global markets has been disrupted by the war. Vital to helping ensure global food supplies was the grain deal, agreed by Russia and Ukraine and brokered by Turkey and the United Nations. The agreement looks set to continue despite Russia expressed security concerns. At the G20 Summit, Ukraine announced plans to feed at least 5 million people facing acute hunger by the end of May 2023.
We have already launched the initiative, Grain from Ukraine, and the first vessel, Nordwind, leaves for Ethiopia with 27,000 tons of wheat on board. This is the amount that can feed almost 100,000 people per year. There can be many such ships from Ukraine, and therefore there will be many people in poor countries who are saved from starvation. Ukraine can export 45 million tons of food this year, and let a significant part of it be directed to those who suffer the most.
But the conflict is just one piece of the puzzle.
We all know that this food crisis that we're in the midst of is caused by multiple factors. It's caused by climate change. We're having a severe drought in the Horn of Africa as we speak. It's caused by COVID, which is disrupting supply chains, and also by conflict. Most of the people in the world that are food insecure today are living in zones and countries that are experiencing conflict. But we're also finding that fertilizer prices are high, fuel prices are high. There have been trade restrictions that some countries have imposed. All of these factors are contributing to the kind of crisis that we have today.
And it's not just food security affected by the Russian attack on Ukraine. The head of the World Trade Organization warned on Wednesday that several major economies face a real risk of sliding into recession.
The fact of what is happening around the war in Ukraine, uncertainty about what will happen with that, when that will end, issues to do with what happens to food prices, energy prices, inflation, the inflationary pressures. There's so many uncertainties, and most of the risks are on the downside.
The Geneva-based body last month projected global trade to rise just 1% in 2023, down sharply from an estimated 3.5% rise for this year. The G20 accounts for more than 80% of the world's gross domestic product, 75% of international trade, and 60% of the population. Ahead of the meeting, Indonesia's President Joko Widodo told US President Biden that he expected concrete partnerships that might help the global recovery to come from the summit. What was managed at the end of the summit, despite other views being expressed, was a declaration by leaders stating that they deplore in the strongest terms Russia's aggression against Ukraine.
Now, a potential key to getting the global economy back on track is improving U.S.-China relations. For the first time since 2017, a U.S. president met Chinese leader Xi Jinping in person. Emerging from their 3.5 hours of talks, Joe Biden delivered a more conciliatory statement. And though a firm agreement on the status of Taiwan remains elusive, Biden said he did not believe China was planning to invade the self-governing island.
I absolutely believe there need not be a new Cold War. I've met many times with Xi Jinping, and we were candid and clear with one another across the board. And I do not think there's any imminent attempt on the part of China to invade Taiwan. And I made it clear that our policy on Taiwan has not changed at all. It's the same exact position we've had. I made it clear that we want to see cross-strait issues peacefully resolved, and so it never has to come to that. And I'm convinced that he understood exactly what I was saying. I understood what he was saying. And look, I think the United States is better prepared than any country in the world, economically and politically, to deal with the changing circumstances around the world.
So let's get more on the G20 Summit now. And joining me from Washington is Mark Langevin. He is professor of international relations at George Mason University and a senior advisor on energy policy for Horizon Client Access. And from London, economist and author of The New Economics, a Manifesto, Steve Keen. Thanks both so much for being with us. So, you know, the G20 has always had a pretty clear mandate to address issues affecting the global economy. This year felt different in that geopolitics really overshadowed almost everything. That, you know, the conflict in Ukraine even meant for the first time a family photo couldn't be taken. So, while there may have been a cloud of sorts hanging over the summit, Mark, when it kicked off, was that cloud kind of started lifting at least over the course of the days to follow?
Well, you're right. I mean, this was a different G20 and there was a cloud over it. There were some piercings of sunlight. I think the meeting between Xi from China and Biden from the United States was a positive note. I think the announcement of assisting Indonesia with its energy transition, again, a positive note. And from the U.S. side, the Biden administration's announcement of some money out of the Millennium Development Corporation for energy transition metals and other equipment from around the world is sunlight. I mean, it's modest steps, but I think it's encouraging.
But when it ended, it definitely, I have to say, just didn't feel as ominous as things did going into it. So, Steve Keen, are you satisfied with the outcome? Was it at least, productive?
I think, certainly looking, say, at the Australian Prime Minister meeting the Chinese Prime Minister and taking some of the stupidity out of Australia-Chinese relations that were there with the previous Conservative government in Australia, that's obviously another good sign. So, dialogue does help. And that's what the G20 enables. And in that sense, yes, it has defused some otherwise extremely worrying trends in 2022.
Right. Okay. Well, both of you mentioned China first things. So, Mark, I'll come back to you. I mean, how much would it really mean, to the global economy and the global balance of power, I guess, to get the U.S.-China trade relation really fully back on track?
Well, there's no doubt that the global political economy needs China and the United States on the same page, working together to fend off a global recession first and foremost, and to accelerate the energy transition within a paradigm of achieving energy security, especially for those countries like Indonesia and India that are very much reliant on coal, and coal is the #1 fossil fuel we've got to reduce immediately. So I think China and the United States can play a great partnership in that. Of course, there are problems on the trade side. They need more dialogue and they need more ways of finding cooperation and avoiding trade conflict at every corner, which is difficult from both sides. But I think it's possible if they intensify the dialogue between the two governments.
Steve, would you agree there? And I mean, for you, how fundamental is getting China and the U.S., back to what it was before? It was a strong relationship, to put it in a trivial way. But it really meant that, industry was so focused in China and that production where China was able to benefit from that side and the U.S. consumer power was on the other side. And it seemed to work for the global economy. You can correct me if I'm wrong, but is that where the globe would be better off again?
I don't believe so. I think, in fact, it's been a mistake to go down this track as far as we've gone. Globalization was supposed to be about, the neoclassic, the conventional economics idea of comparative advantage. China is supposed to have the comparative advantage in manufacturing American services. In fact, that's nonsense. What really drove it was low wages in China and low regulation initially. China has done brilliantly in turning out and making it the world's industrial powerhouse, but that's given us an artificial downward trend in inflation for the last pretty much 40 years. And now we're seeing that unwinding, and climate change will make it even more necessary. We simply cannot continue shipping huge numbers of manufactured goods and volumes from one country to another with all the extra carbon dioxide that generates with shipping alone. And so a lot of production is going to come onshore. I think we're going to see a reversal of that trend, and I think it's a necessary reversal. So I don't think we don't want to continue what's happened for the last 40 years, because that was an unsustainable trend of relying upon cheap wages in China, which have now pretty much been eliminated, but also ignoring the environmental costs of that huge distribution of production on one side of the planet and consumption on the other, and that has to end.
Okay, then help us understand what you think the new dynamic should be. If it didn't work for China to be that global manufacturer, who's supposed to take over? I mean, China has that infrastructure.
Oh,
It's been doing it for decades, like you said.
China has the infrastructure. Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
America's going to find. America's going to find it has to do a larger amount of rebuilding of capacities that it's destroyed in the last 40 years to exploit that wage advantage, wage difference with China. So I think. I don't think it was Biden, but one of the previous, certainly not the last American president, but actually was the president of one of the computer companies, said that if you held a meeting of all the machine tools experts in America, you could hold it in a conference room. If you wanted to hold the same meeting in China, you'd need a football stadium. And so America has to get back to the stage of having a football stadium full of machine tools, capable engineers, and that's an incredibly hard thing to turn around.
Mark, I'm wondering what your thoughts are there. I mean, if you think the entire global dynamic then has to shift, because a lot of people saw it quite, like yourself, saw it very encouraging that the U.S. and China seem to be looking to return to what they were, let's say, pre-Trump. But Steve seems to see that as completely the wrong track. It was unsustainable anyway. Do you agree in any sense there?
Well, I think I'm talking about the political dialogue that was established and intensified during the Obama administration. I think there's a possibility there. Now, getting back to Steve's point, the pandemic did a big shock to the global supply chains in the manufacturing sector, and they're not going to come back the way they were before. Meanwhile, we've got the fourth industrial revolution, precision, artificial intelligence, robotics doing the manufacturing now. That's going to occur everywhere that robots are made available to do manufacturing. That's certainly the case here in the United States, increasingly in China and so forth. So what we're moving towards are more smart supply chains that are going to balance resiliency with domestic manufacturing with just efficient export-import of manufacturing components. And China is still going to play a major role in both assembly and the manufacture of smart components. So, I think we're just moving towards another iteration of this global manufacturing chain, but it's going to be smarter. There's going to be more national security conditions placed on manufacturing, but I think we still are going to see large manufacturing trade coming out of China.
Okay, interesting. So not a total reset, but still a change in the fundamental dynamic there. Let me ask you though, Mark, because you talked about the political dialogue that has changed. Going forward though, do you think China now will stay away from Taiwan, especially having witnessed Russia's position now on the global stage after invading Ukraine? I mean, I'll bring up the family photo again, just the fact that no one wanted to stand in a photo with Sergei Lavrov, it symbolically says a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, China has been, in a sense, withdrawing step by step from a big footprint in that conflict in and around Ukraine. I think the shovels are metaphor. I think there's an interest amongst the big players, India, China, the United States, European Union, Canada. I'm not sure about Australia, Steve, about working together to redouble collective security and help resolve the conflict in Ukraine. On Taiwan, I think it just requires more dialogue. There are more paths open for Beijing to get what it wants from Taiwan in cooperation with some of the other major players. So, yeah, Biden and Xi really toned down the rhetoric and the tensions, and I think that opens up space to explore more constructive options that, of course, the shovels try to reflect to the global public.
Okay. Steve, if you had a comment, go ahead. I didn't see you disagreeing necessarily with what you heard. If not, I'd like to move on.
Well,
Go ahead.
mainly that we are going to see, I think, much more focus on resilience rather than efficiency, and that we went too far down the efficiency track, and that's because the obvious sign of that was in Europe. Within a day of the pandemic breaking out, the supply of personal protection equipment was exhausted. Because and you couldn't make them locally, didn't have the manufacturers. Now you're not going to leave yourself in that situation again, I hope. So a large reliance on forgetting about the so-called efficiency of distributing production around the planet. You need to have critical manufacturing capabilities either in your domestic economy or within reach of it without shipping. And I think that's going to be, I hope that's a major change for going forward.
Okay, Mark doesn't think so. Quickly, Mark, go ahead.
Well, what we found out, for example, in the steel and aluminum tariffs that former President Trump implemented 2017, we actually lost jobs in the downstream industries dependent on efficiently produced steel and aluminum. So that's something that we're dealing with in Washington. Yeah, we'd love to bolster our steel and aluminum manufacturing, but they're going to have to be more efficient because they can't compete against other countries, many of which are democracies with full labor rights. Also, it really discourages foreign direct investment into the United States in these downstream industries. And we're talking about the high value added manufacturing. So we've got to balance resiliency, as Steve has pointed out, with efficiency. And that's why I think we're moving towards more smart global supply chains to kind of balance out the threat of inflation with some of the national security concerns that we have.
Okay. I'll tell you what, let's move on to into the energy crisis, which you've both alluded to. And Steve, I mean, what about the energy crisis? First, I want to say it seems we might be averting the worst because of thanks to global warming, the warmer than average temperatures we've seen in the Northern Hemisphere so far this year, meaning people aren't turning on their heaters as early as usual. So at the very least, we may have bought ourselves some time.
We have, by sheer accident. I mean, global warming has cured a problem caused by global warming, which is ironic, but of course that can also invert very rapidly. The reason it's been so warm in Europe has been what we've done to the jet stream by global warming makes it so unstable that you've now got where it rather than being like a circle around the Arctic, it's now almost like a star around the Arctic. And where the star points go down, you get cold weather. Where the star points go up, you get warm weather. But Europe is stuck in a warm bubble right now. But I've seen reports saying that the minimum temperature in the Arctic has now fallen to minus 84 degrees Celsius. And when that spreads, the area of cold could actually cause a severe winter. So if that comes through, the short-term buffer we've got could disappear very rapidly, again, because of global warming.
Right.
So I think we've been lucky at the moment. That luck may not last.
And Mark, over the course of the G20, I mean, did you see any real solutions to if the inverse suddenly happens that Steve was referring to? I mean, it could. We don't know with global warming, and the circumstances could change at any minute. Are the G20 countries prepared for whatever could happen in the energy space?
Well, I don't think they are. We didn't see any big moves on financing adaptation in the developing world. That's something that we need to focus on. Maybe we'll get there at the next COP28. in Dubai. But I think there's some attention paid to coal. Look, at coal is the big thing that we've got to reduce. We need a global ban on coal-fired power plants. We need to stop digging coal, and that's a message to China, India, and Indonesia in particular. So we need to find a way to help these countries move away from coal as quickly as possible. But we know that China and other countries are planning like some 300 gigawatts of coal-fired power plants in the coming years, and that's something that the G20 is not going to resolve. But I think the Biden administration, Macron from France, and others can sit down with China, Indonesia, and India and see if we can't lessen that dependence on coal and begin a transition away from coal, because that's the spearhead of this global fight against global warming is coal.
Yeah, I mean, they've had the opportunities to sit down. They were all just at, COP27, now meeting at the G20, and we're still not really hearing answers because everyone wants to put this on hold while we deal with other crises mostly centered on the conflict in Ukraine. But Steve, we just have a few minutes left, so I wanted to ask you specifically, because you had stated before that you were specifically worried about global trade. You had said that governments are actually doing the wrong thing for the wrong reasons when it comes to addressing global trade. How so?
Well, again, they're following economic textbooks. And the best thing you can do with the economic textbook is keep your house warm in winter, light it and burn it, because they live in a fictional world where comparative advantage plays a major role in those fictions. So it distorts what is actually sensible. We should be looking, as I emphasize, we need resilience, not efficiency, as the first focus going forward. What gives you technological growth is technological change, it's not specialization. So that was all bad advice we've followed for far too long. We need to break away. The trouble is we're still following the advice of economists in how we estimate the potential damage to the economy from global warming. And people like William Nordhaus have claimed in published refereed articles in the leading American journals that a 6 degrees increase in global temperature would only reduce GDP by 8.5%. Now, you talk to scientists, 6 degrees global warming, there will be no civilization left. Following the strictures of economists has led us badly astray.
Mark, final thoughts?
We need more flexibility with all the kinds of equipment for solar, wind power. I think there's movement there, to allow for more subsidies, including the Biden administration encouraging the Europeans to subsidize and protect their own energy transition equipment manufacturing chain. So I think there's room there. We just need to accelerate everything. And that I'm in total agreement with Steve.
What are the chances, though, of acceleration, given how slow the process has been so far?
Here in Washington, Biden is doing a lot more than anyone anticipated. Of course, we've got political problems here in the United States, but I think Biden's overperforming on this energy transition strategy.
Okay. That is, unfortunately, all the time we have for this edition of The Newsmakers. I'd like to thank you both so much for being with me on this program, and our viewers, of course, for being with us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter @the_newsmakers, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. Thanks for watching.